There were a lot of interesting horror games to find home on the PlayStation, with a few of them being ports of PC and earlier platforms that would be very dark and gritty and very gory, that for its time would leave a lasting impact, especially if you were somewhat of a young player. It definitely left a mark on you. But with it being an experimental time, it was interesting to see these games being developed and come to life. But a lot of these games, especially when they were ported to the PlayStation, they would only see a release in Japan only, so for most of us growing up never even knew that these games existed. And one of the games in question that we'll be looking at here is known as Darkseid, which is a psychological horror point and click adventure that was originally released in 1992 but was later ported to the PlayStation and other consoles, along with the Sega Saturn. There would be a later sequel with Darkseid 2 that would also get a port to the PlayStation. So with the plot revolves around the protagonist, known as Mike, who is a successful writer who has recently bought an old mansion that comes with its own dark history. And the plot begins with Mike having a nightmare as he is asleep one evening, and he has visions of being imprisoned in an alternate reality where some form of machine shoots an alien embryo into his brain, and it depicts everything in the visual nature like in a movie, and it's very, very graphic, let's just say that. It's not everybody's cup of tea really. How would you put it? Back then it would have been something that would have left you sick to your stomach. It's very out there in terms of how it presents itself, and this is literally at the start of the game, mind you, but a lot of these older games depicted that sense of horror literally from the very get-go, and it definitely got the psychological elements right in creating that very unnerving tension that would follow you throughout the game from that point on. So as Mike wakes up, he ends up with a large headache, so he takes a painkiller and a shower and begins to then explore the mansion, which you will have control of him as you try to go throughout the different rooms and look at all of the items and the areas to explore. But as you explore, you will also uncover elements around the previous owner of the mansion who died, which reveal the existence of a parallel universe known as the Dark World that is ruled by aliens. And that's pretty much where the game kind of changes hand, because you do play in the real world in real time, but you also move between different realities, and all these elements all contribute to the progression of the story. Now with that being said, with the gameplay, it is a point and click adventure, which means you are limited in terms of how the game moves and your control systems and so forth, because you have to click on an item to get you to do something, and to even interact, to solve puzzles and to find objects that you'll need for progression. But one of the major issues with the game upon its release was the fact that you had 3 hours to complete the main game, which would act as like 3 days in real time. That required you to solve many intricate puzzles, but some of them being very, very difficult and time sensitive, and a lot of them didn't really have any solutions. And as the game has different narratives and endings available, some of the interactive elements are so poorly implemented that they can destroy the effect of the game, leading it to virtually being unfinishable or unplayable to a degree, and you never end up fully getting the ending that you're looking for, which unfortunately will end up requiring you to restart the game from the beginning only to go over and do it again. Now in the current age with emulation, we can create save states that allow us to save points before we tackle various puzzles and reload them quickly, so we don't have to play through the entire game all over again. But I can only imagine the frustration back in the day of the amount of attempts that would have been required, because you may have put maybe 2.5 hours, almost 3 hours into the game, only to fall at the last hurdle on a puzzle that didn't make sense and would completely destroy your playthrough, only to be forced to do it all over again. And this could take multiple attempts to do and still never get it right. And I'll be honest, having grown up in that period, I did play a lot of games like this myself, and I can understand the frustrations, because you want to give it a good shot, but the fact is that a lot of it requires much trial and error in order to overcome the hurdles. It's just sometimes more hassle than it's worth to play.
It's a calm neighborhood out here. My house seems strangely empty and unoccupied. Boy, my head hurts. Here's an entry to an old cemetery, overgrown with weeds. These nightmares have given me a mean headache. It seems like I've had this headache since I moved in. Boy, my head hurts. My head is killing me. This place looks like no one has been around and attended for a long time. My head feels like it's going to explode.
Now, if you're a patient player, yeah, you will have that determination in order to keep going, but for a lot of other players, no, you won't. You'll end up walking away from it. There was a common trait with a lot of games being developed around this time. While they did have some very interesting ideas, and this was also described in the reviews and the reception that it got, the game had a lot of character and had a lot of promise. But the major issue with a lot of these games, and many of them have imported to the PlayStation, especially during the early months and years, is that they all emphasise the gameplay elements severely around trial and error. That you have to attempt and just hope that you get lucky enough to be able to hit the right button, or to make the right choice, or to solve the puzzle in the right time, or not even knowing which avenue to take in order to solve a puzzle, just hoping that you hit the right one in order to proceed. And while, yeah, you could think of it as an interesting gameplay mechanic, but the fact is that you have to leave everything to chance. It isn't all that appealing. I suppose developers back then thought that that'd be a fun aspect, thought that it would keep players more engaged, and to some, like, it probably did, but it was more hassle than it was worth. You were more liable to take the game out of the console and just snap the disc altogether, out of pure frustration, which I'm sure people did. Let's just put it that way. And even its sequel, Dark Seed 2, would use a similar outlay in terms of its gameplay mechanics, so there wasn't really as much improvement with regards to that. But it just seemed to be a thing during that time, especially with these type of point and click adventures. While they did have a lot of really cool ideas, and in fairness to this era, like, I know when we look at survival horror games, like Resident Evil obviously started the whole trend of it being popular, but even before Resident Evil there was a lot of these early point and click horror games that were very, very unnerving and very atmospheric, very, very scary too, even more so than most of the games that came after it, with very graphic and visual scenes that, yeah, imagine if like you're say 10, 11, 12, in your younger years, even in your early teens, there were definitely some violent, vivid images in these games that definitely would have made you run for the hills. I know for me, that was definitely a thing. Up until I played Resident Evil, I wouldn't touch a horror game, I wouldn't even go near it, I wouldn't even watch a horror film. And when I seen stuff like that, like the scenes that you would see here earlier in this game, that was it. You just didn't want to go any further with it. But realistically, these games would only have appealed to a distinctive type of player. Now, yes, over recent times, people have become more aware of these concepts and do appreciate them for what they try to do, but they're still a struggle to get through. And the fact is that the main issue is the trial and error concept, that everything is left to chance. It just doesn't make it appealing, and that's why you don't really see that in games of today, because it just isn't a good narrative to follow. But it's a reflection of its time. This is the way games were being developed. Everything was left to chance, but at the same time you were limited in how you could utilise and interact with different elements, especially with it being a point and click adventure. You had to know the game inside out, but even at that, there was a lot of random elements that sometimes you just had to take a gamble to see if you'd win or not, and if you failed, pretty much game over. You'd either get the bad ending or you'd have to restart the entirety of the game again, which many of us simply were not willing to do, which is its main downfall at the end of the day. And like I said, it was stated in the reviews that the game itself had a lot of promise, which it did. It is very atmospheric. It is actually a scary game. It really is. If anything, it was one of the scariest games for its time when it was released in the early 90s. It just had a unique ambience around it and something that really just got under your skin, but just certain gameplay aesthetics just limited the appeal of it, really. But even with that being said, the story does have a unique and interesting aspect to it. The fact is that you're playing from both the real world and moving into an alternate reality, and the player, the character is Mike. As you progress, you have to try and find out more of what's happening to him and why this embryo that is actually in his head based off of his nightmare. So he literally got a vivid telling of his future, pretty much. So obviously he has to find a way of stopping it, which he will do depending on the ending that you get. But if you like point and click adventure games, especially even on consoles, this might be one more trying. And even for most of us back in the day, like I said, a lot of us really did not know anything about these games or even knew that they even existed. So for that appeal alone, because they're so limited and rare, they are worth checking out just for that experience alone. But with that being said, I would love to know your thoughts of Dark Seed for the PlayStation, and what did you think of it overall? Did you even know about this game or even its series? And what did you think of it overall? Did you manage to even play it yourself back in the day? So be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around other unusual, rare and quirky horror games like this, they're also released on the PlayStation. And you can check out this playlist here on screen to see a lot more of those games in action. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.
Given me a